I wasn't leaving an abuser. I felt like I was becoming one. The guilt was crushing, unbearable, made me physically sick, kept me awake at night replaying every conversation, every decision, every moment I could have done differently. I cried more leaving him than I'd cried during the entire 9 years we were together, and that guilt wasn't natural. It was installed, carefully, systematically, over nearly a decade. He'd made leaving feel like the cruelest thing I could do. Like I was abandoning someone who needed me. Like I was breaking someone fragile. Like I was the monster. And that was the control, the final mechanism, the last lock on the cage. I spent 9 years in a relationship where guilt became my primary emotion. My constant companion, my way of existing. Guilt for having needs, guilt for expressing feelings, guilt for taking up space, guilt for wanting things, guilt for being disappointed, guilt for being hurt. And when I finally decided to leave, when I finally chose myself after nearly a decade of choosing him, the guilt became unbearable, became crushing, became the thing that almost kept me there, almost made me stay, almost convinced me that leaving was worse than staying. And that guilt, that overwhelming, crushing guilt about leaving, that was the final proof that I needed to go. I'm 61, I left 6 years ago, and it took me 4 years to understand that the guilt I felt when leaving wasn't my guilt, wasn't natural guilt, wasn't appropriate guilt for ending an unhealthy relationship. It was installed guilt, manufactured guilt, guilt he'd been building in me systematically for years, creating the foundation, laying the groundwork, ensuring that if I ever tried to leave, the guilt would be so crushing, so unbearable, so overwhelming that I'd come back, or I'd stay, or at minimum, I'd suffer enormously for choosing myself. That's when I understood the guilt wasn't mine. It was his weapon. And it almost worked. If you've ever felt crushing guilt for leaving someone who hurt you, if you felt like you were the bad person for choosing yourself, if you felt more guilt leaving than you felt pain staying, if you've realized the guilt was so overwhelming, it almost kept you trapped. You already know what I'm describing. You already know how guilt can be weaponized, how it can be installed, how it can become the invisible fence that keeps you contained even when the door is open. And I'm realizing as I tell you this, some of you are drowning in guilt right now. Guilt about leaving or thinking about leaving or wanting to leave. Guilt that feels bigger than the pain you're escaping. So here's what I need to know. What do you feel most guilty about? Just drop it in the comments. I feel guilty for blank. Let's see if we're all carrying the same manufactured. Guilt because I spent 9 years thinking the guilt was proof. I was doing something wrong proof. I was being selfish proof. I was the problem. The guilt wasn't proof of anything except that he'd done his job well. Now, let me tell you how guilt became a weapon, how it was installed so carefully I didn't notice it happening, how it became the final lock that almost kept me trapped forever. It started with him teaching me I was responsible for his happiness. We met when I was 52, he was 55, both divorced decades ago. Both had adult children, grown grandchildren. Both thought we were too old, too experienced, too wise to fall into unhealthy patterns. I'd been single for 15 years, had built a life I loved, had independence, had friendships, had routines, had peace. Wasn't looking for a relationship, but he seemed kind, seemed stable, seemed like someone who'd add to my life without requiring me to dismantle it. Month 3, he mentioned he'd been lonely before meeting me, said his life had felt empty, said I'd changed everything, made him happy in ways he hadn't been happy in years. I felt good hearing that, felt like I was contributing something meaningful, felt like the relationship was adding value to both our lives. Didn't recognize that his happiness becoming my responsibility was the first brick in a foundation that would eventually bury me. Month 6, he started mentioning when he wasn't happy, not accusatory, not blaming, just observational. He'd seem down and I'd ask what was wrong and he'd say he didn't know, just felt off, felt disconnected, Felt like something was missing. I'd ask what I could do, and he'd say, "Nothing. It's not you, just his mood." But over time, I noticed his moods improved when I did certain things, stayed certain ways, prioritized him in specific ways. I started doing those things more, not because he asked, because I learned they made him happy, and his happiness had become my job. Year one, I realized I was managing his emotional state, organizing my choices around his happiness, adjusting my life to maintain his comfort. Not because he demanded it, because I learned that his unhappiness was somehow my failure, his disappointment was somehow my fault, his loneliness was somehow my responsibility. The guilt for his unhappiness was already being installed. I just didn't recognize it yet. Year two, he started mentioning his health, how stress affected him, how his blood pressure would spike when he was upset, how his sleep would suffer when things weren't peaceful, how his anxiety would increase when life felt chaotic. He never said I caused these things, never blamed me directly, just mentioned them. Mentioned that stress was dangerous at his age, mentioned that he needed peace, needed stability, needed calm. And I learned, gradually, systematically, that my choices affected his health, that my decisions had physical consequences for him, that choosing myself might literally hurt him. The guilt foundation was being laid. Every choice I made that prioritized me became weighted with his potential suffering. Year three, I wanted to visit my daughter across the country. Wanted to spend 2 weeks with her and my grandchildren. Mentioned it to him. He said, of course, I should go. He'd be fine. Seemed supportive. Seemed encouraging. I booked the trip the week before I was supposed to leave. He seemed down, seemed withdrawn. I asked what was wrong. He said nothing, just feeling lonely already, just anticipating how empty the house would feel. How long 2 weeks would be. Wasn't trying to make me feel bad, just being honest about his feelings. I almost canceled the trip. The guilt was crushing. The image of him alone, lonely, suffering in my absence felt unbearable. I went, but I called him twice a day, cut the trip short by 4 days. Came home early because the guilt of being away, of choosing time with my daughter over preventing his loneliness, was worse than the joy of being with my family. I'd learned that choosing myself came with unbearable guilt about his suffering. Year four, the pattern was established. I'd think about doing something for myself, immediately feel crushing guilt about how it would affect him, about his loneliness, his stress, his health, his happiness. I do either not do the thing, or I do it while drowning in guilt that made it impossible to enjoy. The guilt had become automatic, had become my primary emotional response to any choice that prioritized me. I was trapped not by his demands, but by my own guilt about his potential suffering. Year five, my best friend noticed, said, "You seem different, seem smaller, seem like you're always worried about him, always checking on him, always prioritizing him." I said, "I just care about him, just want him to be happy." She said, "But what about you? What about your happiness?" I said, "I'm happy when he's happy." She looked sad, said that's not how it should work. That's not what partnership looks like. Her words stayed with me. I started noticing how much of my life was organized around preventing his unhappiness, how many choices I didn't make because of guilt about how they'd affect him, how much I shrunk to maintain his comfort, but the noticing didn't change anything. The guilt was too powerful, too crushing. The idea of choosing myself and causing his suffering felt worse than my own diminishment. Year six, I started feeling trapped, started realizing I built a cage out of guilt, started understanding that I couldn't make choices for myself without overwhelming guilt about his loneliness, his stress, his health, his unhappiness. But I still didn't see it as installed, still didn't recognize it as weapon, still thought the guilt was natural, was proof I cared, was what good partners feel when they're being selfish. Year seven, I started thinking about leaving, not seriously, not planning, just noticing that I wasn't happy, that I lost myself, that the relationship required constant management of his emotional state. Constant sacrifice of my own needs, constant guilt about any choice that prioritized me. Started imagining what it would feel like to be free, to make choices without crushing guilt, to exist without constant responsibility for someone else's happiness. The moment I started thinking about leaving, the guilt became unbearable, crushing, all-consuming. The thought of leaving him, of him being alone, of him suffering, of being responsible for breaking him, destroying him, abandoning him, felt worse than any pain I was experiencing staying. The guilt was the lock, the final mechanism, the thing that kept me trapped even when I could clearly see I needed to leave. Year 8, I told my therapist I was thinking about leaving, but couldn't because the guilt was too overwhelming. She asked what I felt guilty about. I listed everything: abandoning him, leaving him alone, causing his loneliness, affecting his health, breaking someone who needed me, being selfish, being cruel, being the person who gives up. She listened, then asked a question that changed everything. She said, if he was thinking about leaving you, do you think he'd feel this level of guilt? I sat with that question for weeks, realized the answer was no, realized he'd leave if he wanted to without this crushing, unbearable, all-consuming guilt. Realized the guilt was mine, was something I'd been taught to feel, was something that had been installed in me carefully over years. Every mention of his loneliness, his health, his stress, his happiness being my responsibility, all of it had been building this foundation, creating this weapon, ensuring that if I ever tried to leave, the guilt would be so crushing I'd stay or I'd come back, or at a minimum, I'd suffer enormously for choosing myself. That's when I saw it clearly. He hadn't built a relationship. He built a guilt trap. And I'd been living in it for years. Month 94, I decided to leave. The decision took months. The guilt was crushing every single day. I'd wake up feeling sick about it, spend hours crying about it, replay every conversation, every moment, every kindness he'd shown me. Feel like the worst person in the world for leaving someone who loved me, for abandoning someone who needed me, for choosing myself over preventing his suffering. The guilt was worse than anything I'd experienced staying, was worse than the loneliness, the diminishment, the constant management of his emotions. The day I told him I was leaving, he seemed devastated, said he didn't understand, said he thought we were happy, said he'd be lost. Without me, said he didn't know how he'd manage alone, said his health would suffer, said the loneliness would destroy him every fear. I'd had every source of guilt he confirmed made my responsibility. I left anyway, but barely the guilt almost kept me there. The first month after leaving was the worst month of my life. Not because I missed him, because the guilt was unbearable. I'd call him to check on him. He'd sound sad, lonely, struggling. I'd feel like I'd destroyed someone, like I'd done something unforgivable, like I was the abuser and he was the victim. I almost went back a dozen times. The guilt was that crushing, that overwhelming, that all-consuming. Month 2, my daughter said something that helped. Said, Mom, you feel more guilt about leaving him than you felt pain during. 9 years with him, doesn't that tell you something? Doesn't that tell you the guilt is wrong? Is disproportionate, is not natural. I said I'm responsible for his suffering. She said you're responsible for your own life. His suffering is his to manage. His loneliness is his to address. His happiness is his job, not yours. You didn't break him by leaving. You freed yourself from being responsible for him. It took me 2 years to understand she was right. 2 years to understand the guilt wasn't natural, wasn't proportionate, wasn't appropriate for ending an unhealthy relationship. The guilt was installed, was manufactured, was the final layer of control. He'd spent 9 years making me responsible for his happiness, his health, his emotional state, so that if I ever tried to leave, the guilt would be crushing enough to keep me trapped, or bring me back, or at minimum punish me severely for choosing myself. 6 years out, I still feel echoes of that guilt, still catch myself feeling guilty for choices that prioritize me. Still have moments where I feel responsible for other people's happiness. The training went deep, ran deep. The guilt was installed carefully over years, and uninstalling it takes time, takes conscious effort, takes constant reminding that I'm not responsible for other people's emotional states. But leaving unhealthy relationship isn't cruel, that choosing myself isn't selfish. I'm learning that guilt is supposed to be feedback about genuine harm we've caused, not a constant state we live in, not a weapon used to control us, not something we feel for having boundaries, having needs, choosing ourselves. Healthy guilt is proportionate, is specific, is about actual harm. Manufactured guilt is crushing, is constant, is about existing, about having needs, about prioritizing ourselves. And that manufactured guilt, that installed guilt, that's not relationship, that's control. Here's what I desperately wish someone had told me the first time I felt crushing guilt about a choice that prioritized me. The first time his happiness became my responsibility. The first time his loneliness became my fault. If someone makes you responsible for their emotional state, if your choices that benefit you create crushing guilt about harming them, if leaving feels worse than staying, if the guilt is overwhelming, disproportionate, all-consuming, that guilt isn't natural, that guilt is installed, is manufactured, is the cage, is the final walk, is the weapon that keeps you trapped even when you can clearly see you need to leave. If you're reading this and you're drowning in guilt about leaving or thinking about leaving, if the guilt feels worse than the pain of staying, if you feel like you'd be abandoning someone who needs you, if you feel responsible for someone else's happiness, health, emotional state, that responsibility is the trap, that guilt is the weapon. You're not responsible for other people's emotional states. Leaving unhealthy relationship isn't cruel. Choosing yourself isn't selfish, and if the guilt is crushing, overwhelming, disproportionate, that's not your guilt. That's installed guilt. That's manufactured guilt. And you can leave anyway. You can choose yourself anyway. You can walk through the guilt and discover it was the last lock on a cage you were always allowed to leave. If this resonated, if you've realized guilt was the weapon that almost kept you trapped, the next video is crucial. It's called He Needed You Confused. Clarity Was His Enemy. It's about how confusion wasn't accidental, wasn't you being unable to understand, wasn't the relationship being complicated. Confusion was strategic, was manufactured, was how he kept you off balance, kept you questioning yourself, kept you from seeing clearly enough to name what was happening. Because clarity was his enemy, confusion was his weapon, and keeping you confused kept you controlled. Link is on screen now.